Hello, everyone. Good morning for people who are watching us in Brazil. Today, we welcome everyone to the 80th webinar of 2001, held by the Graduate Program Economics of the Institute of Economics of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. As many of you already know, we have in these webinars the aim to broaden the debate in economics, including more interdisciplinary and pluralistic discussions of contemporary issues. And today, we have the pleasure, we are glad to welcome Annela Anger-Kraavi and Camila Gramkow. Annela leads the Climate Change Policy Group at the Yusuf Hamied Department of Chemistry of the University of Cambridge. She's also a co-chair of the Katowice Committee of Experts on the Impacts of the Implementation of Response Measures, KCI, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Vice Chair of its subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, and the EU negotiator to the same organization. It's a long CV. We are trying to keep it short here. Sorry. And she's also the chief executive of the Cambridge Trust for New Thinking Economics, an educational charity that promotes new developments in economics discipline.
And Camila works in sustainability area for more than 10 years. Currently, she's Economic Affairs Officer at United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean at its office in Brazil. Camila is also a former student of our master's program in economics, so welcome back, Camila. And today, they will discuss climate change economics, perspectives from post-Keynesian large-scale macroeconometric modeling, based on a paper resulting from Camila's PhD thesis, produced under the supervision of Dr. Annela. So we want to thank to both of you once again for accepting our invitation. Please feel very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Norberto and Lydia. It's really a pleasure to be here. As you said, I was a master's student at the Economics Institute, so I'm very happy to be here with you today. And also, of course, with Annela, who was my supervisor for this paper we will be presenting today. So I hope that you will be able to see my screen. So today we'll be talking to you about the paper titled Developing Green, a case for the Brazilian manufacturing sector, which, as mentioned, is the result of my PhD thesis under the supervision of Dr. Annela. We'll be covering the objective and the methodology with an emphasis on the E3ME model and the economic thinking behind this model. We'll present you the scenario building, the main assumptions, some results and analysis, and some final remarks. So the objective of this research was to evaluate the impacts of the introduction of a portfolio of green fiscal policies that stimulate the adoption of mitigation technologies by manufacturing sectors in Brazil. Basically, what we were interested in was assessing the impacts of policies that induce low carbon investments in the manufacturing sectors of Brazil. We were very much interested in the manufacturing sectors in particular because there was very little research on these specific sectors in the country. We know that the main driver of greenhouse gas emissions in the country is land use change in forestry and agriculture. So the country's greenhouse gas emissions are very much related to the dynamics of the land, of the use of the land, and of the agriculture sector. However, there is a silent increase, let's say, of emissions in the other sectors that can be more difficult and more costly to overcome if the country remains on this trajectory. And these sectors are mainly the energy sector and, of course, the manufacturing sector. If we look at the data, we see that there is a historic increase in the greenhouse gas emissions of the manufacturing sectors since the beginning of the data, that is, since the data began to be measured from the beginning of the 1990s. So that is the topic we wanted to address, the scarce information about how to decarbonize the manufacturing sectors in Brazil, and also because, as you will see when we discuss more about the theoretical thinking behind the model, we understand that the manufacturing sectors are the locus of development. I am based, as Lydia mentioned, at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, or CEPAL, and as you know, we have a very relevant, we understand the relevance of the manufacturing sectors, of industrialization, of high added value sectors for the development. So the focus on manufacturing sectors responds to this double challenge of responding to scarce information on greening manufacturing sectors and understanding how these very important sectors for development could become more sustainable in the country. The methodology that we used was a quantitative evaluation of alternative scenarios. So we developed some scenarios we'll be presenting to you shortly. And we used a model named E3ME, which is a large-scale macroeconometric model of the economy, energy, and environment systems to model and quantify these alternative scenarios. Annela, shall I hand over to you? I think you're muted.
Let me try again. Yes, I was muted. So thank you, Camila, and hello, everyone. It's quite late here, and I know it's more for you. So we're really happy to be here at this seminar. Thanks for the invitation, and really, really great to join Camila again, who is now back in Brazil, and we're still in touch. But it was a great experience to be her PhD supervisor, and I'm really pleased that we're here together. So E3ME, as Camila mentioned, was used for this study. E3ME is a global macroeconometric energy environment economy model. So, and it's a large scale model, and often it's called as an old-fashioned model. And why it's called an old-fashioned model? Because these type of models were developed in 1950s, 1960s. It's based on national accounting, and it was developed, the original model that wasn't called E3ME at that time was MDM. It was a multi-regional dynamic model of the UK economy, was developed at Cambridge University. And after that, where the funding discontinued, then this model was taken to a consulting company called Cambridge Econometrics. It's a spin-off of the university. But interesting is that this model, the first person who started to develop this model was Sir Richard Stone, who actually got Nobel Prize for developing the double entry national accounting. And the model is, as you can see from this slide, is a macroeconometric simulation model with no equilibrium in the model. And how does it work? So it's, as most of the large models, is based on input-output tables, so that you probably also learn about those and know where they're coming from. And so it's multi-regional, as we said, and then there are like the relationships within each of the regions. So the model currently has, I think we have another slide with that, but it has 69 regions. And and the equations, each of the region has 43 to 69 industries. So, and then there's like 23 sets of long-term and short-term, or we could say short-term and long-term equations, estimate econometric equations. So it's very sort of path-dependent model. So it takes the past and projects it to the future. And it's a really difficult model to maintain because every year you get new data coming in, you need to re-estimate all the equations. So, and previous slide was that the model does not, you can see that you can't get the equilibrium relationship out of this because it does not, there's nothing that goes to equilibrium. So, but how does it solve? So they are normal, there is the normal output equations in the model. So these are based on understanding that what would happen, what would be the normal way of the economy developing, but that doesn't mean that it's an equilibrium. So, and then you have short-term equations give you short-term shocks, you see more, and so quantities and prices can change. And then in long term, it gravitates back to this sort of the normal trajectory, but it does not have equilibrium in it. And that means that this model has also resources available. So it's still different from general equilibrium models. So, there are idle resources that could be used. So for example, labor, and also resources. So there's also, why we said it's hybrid model, there's also technology models, and that's now this particular version Camila used for her PhD had energy technology submodel in it, electricity technology. So, and there you have resource constraints there for that particular submodel. So, but in general, in economic terms, there's always some labor available. So if you increase the investment, when normally in general equilibrium models, it gets crowded out, then in this model, there's some flexibility. There's like idle investment increases output. So, and what constrains it in economic terms is the availability of labor. So, and labor projections there, labor is exogenous projections the model is using. So it cannot estimate how many people will be in each of the countries or regions of the model. So all main economies are represented. That also means that Brazil is one of the regions in the model, and often it's said it's new economics model, but I would say it's new old economics because it's a post-Keynesian. It sort of very much follows the Keynesian tradition, but it's developed further. So there's nothing really that brings everything equilibrium, nothing that violently adjusts prices to have the equilibrium state. There's no perfect foresight of agents because estimations of equations is based on behavior, and there's nothing that says that this behavior that is in the equations was rational. So, and there are two-way linkages between economic system and the energy system. So the demand in economic system generates energy demand, and energy demand again can feed back in price-wise to the economy. So it puts up prices and impacts the economy and reduce the demand. And from energy use, and like Camila will talk about manufacturing sector. So from that, there are identities in the model that can take you to certain fuel use, what fuels are used, depend on prices, and then from there you can find the emissions. And the model also has the industrial emissions, but they are like more exogenous than endogenous to the model. So basically, so now if you start taxing something or putting pressure, changing prices, then you get the responses from the model. I hope I covered more or less, but then there's another picture here. You can look closer and think about the linkages in the model at your leisure time. And I wouldn't stop here. I'd like to leave some time for Camila to talk about the scenarios. I hope I didn't forget anything important about the model, Camila.
You were great, Annela. Thank you very much. And just a parenthesis here in our presentation. So Annela was the main motivation for me to pursue my PhD at the University of East Anglia because of her work with this type of modeling. I don't know any other type of model in Brazil that is remotely similar to E3ME, both in its scale, sectoral detail, and also in terms of the economic thinking behind this model. So it's a very interesting tool. It's a very powerful tool, but it's also a very complex one. And as Annela was saying, it's impossible to describe all the equations in, I don't know, 15 minutes, but I'm happy to share the model's manual and more information in which you can try and understand more. But I suppose that if you are familiar with post-Keynesian economics, with structuralist economics, you will familiarize yourself with the way the model works. And yeah, I also wanted to, go ahead.
It's an interesting thing I forgot to say. Sorry to interrupt you. Camila said I was the reason why she came to do her PhD with me, and for me the reason why I did my PhD using that model, it was my own PhD supervisor actually developed this model, and it's Professor Terry Parker from Cambridge University. But what I forgot to say that you may want to put the question: how do the regions, how they are linked to each other, and they're linked to trade data. Trade relationships. So what is really interesting about this model is that when you have impact on one region in the model, then you can see how it impacts other regions outside that particular regions you're applying the policy on, like either subsidies or tax or something. And it makes it really, it's very complex, but it's really interesting. And it's more important here when you run the model to look like the direction of the change than the magnitude itself, because it's very difficult to predict future. And we're not aiming for that, but then because if you have built the model and you have established a relationship between the regions and different variables in your equations, then you can at least get the feel which way the things might go. And very often when we run the model, we do find something we didn't think of, because one head cannot compute so many things. And then you find something and then you start exploring and then you realize, oh yes, so we have an impact on this industry, but we're dealing with that industry, but actually the impact is in another place. Comes out like we have a very good examples like when you reduce certain consumption, you tax certain carbon intensive goods, and then suddenly you find in the model that, for some reason the tourism sector is going up. Of course, if people spend less money on some goods, then they have, buy less, consume less, for example, expensive goods like meat or something, for example, then you have more money left and you can take another trip. It's just like this type of, it's very interesting to explore. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, it has its faults. And of course, there's quite a lot of noise, but it's a nice thing to play with, really. So shall I do the data as well, Camila? Or? So we said it runs annually up to 2050. Data quality and availability can be a problem because not all regions have like proper national accounts data. So for some regions, we do use proxies, use other similar regions. Even if we have a shorter time series, we just then take it forward by just applying the growth rates from other regions. It's econometric, I talked about that. So it's based on historical relationships. Over 30-year data is underlying each of the equations that I estimated. So the equations are actually estimated outside the model and parameters are right in, because it makes it easier to operate. But there's an entire team in the company consultancy company who updates the model. And yeah, there are complex relationships between the different sectors, and given the number of regions, number of industries, consumption goods, and there's also division by labor division by age, and so it's quite a complex model. And it doesn't exclude the financial markets. Financial sectors are like as a sectors, but also because the historical data already incorporates the impacts of money and loans and lending. So they are inherently embedded into that model. But it's not explicit, like it could be better. The financial sector could be presented better. Money or credit could be represented better in the model. But yeah, so these are probably some of the limitations. But it's a very data intensive, and you could, if you really wanted, you can see for around 5,000 variables in there that you could look at.
Yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize the point that there is no assumption about equilibrium in the model. And what we mean by that is there's no assumption leading to market clearance. And that is particularly important for developing countries. As you know, there are major disequilibriums, persistent disequilibriums, external disequilibriums in trade, persistent high unemployment rates, persistent high part of the labor force that is of the population that is out of the labor force. So all of these disequilibriums, they can persist in this model, and they can be broadened. So it's interesting. This is one of the things that caught my attention in the model, because it can reproduce real world situations. It can reproduce development gaps, and you can see how these can be affected by different simulations. So let's move on to the scenarios we developed, and these were the scenarios that we modeled with E3ME. So we have one reference scenario. The reference scenario is the one against which all other scenarios are compared on our analysis. And the scenario that we used was the International Energy Agency current policy scenarios of 2014. And this is a scenario which assumes that all trends observed will continue as they are, and that all the policies will continue as they are. And in particular, it does not assume any additional climate policies, any additional mitigation policies, or any additional incentives for low carbon investments. So that's the base, the reference against which we compare, and I'll talk a bit more on the results about what this means for Brazil. And then we have a set of 11 green fiscal policy scenarios that simulate different combinations of fiscal policies to help manufacturing sectors invest in low carbon technologies. The reform, we are a bit of time traveling here, but it would have started in 2018, and the time frame is annual. The model produces annual results for each country, for each sector, for each energy user, etc., until 2030, which is the time frame of the Brazil NDC. So which are the green fiscal policy scenarios that we simulated? We took the path of looking at technology-specific investments. So we wanted to test or assess the impact of investments for specific technologies in the manufacturing sector. So we could call the first block of scenarios of mini green fiscal reforms, in the sense that we are simulating only investments in energy efficiency in the manufacturing sectors, or only investments in the circular economy, in material savings and recycling, or investments only in shifting from coal to natural gas, or only investments in renewable electric generation in manufacturing sectors. So in the first block, we are interested in looking at mini reforms that would help us understand the impact of each technology separately. And I want to highlight here that the sustainable biomass scenario is the scenario in which all of the use of biomass by the manufacturing sector in Brazil would come from a sustainable origin, in the sense that all deforestation associated with unsustainable biomass that the manufacturing sector use in the country would be substituted by biomass from sustainable sources, from reforestation. So in this scenario, we actually have investments in the forestry sector to produce the necessary biomass for the manufacturing sector. And I'm highlighting this because this is a scenario that has a lot of interesting results. And the cogeneration scenario represents investments or stimulus for investments by manufacturing sectors in cogeneration technologies that combine heat and electric production. And then in the second block, we start aggregating these technologies, and this can be seen as the green fiscal reforms becoming more ambitious. There are stimulus not only for energy efficiency, but for energy efficiency, material savings, and recycling. We start adding progressively more and more technologies until we reach the more ambitious fiscal reform that would provide incentives for all low carbon technologies at the same time. So which green fiscal policies are we talking about? When we work with modeling, of course, we need to be very specific about what we want to model and what kinds of analysis we can make. And this is also a difference between most studies that you will find on simulating green scenarios versus business as usual, because we wanted the investments to be endogenous, in the sense that we didn't simply assume the investments would happen. We have simulated the policies required for these investments to happen. So which policies did we model? We modeled tax reductions. Brazil is a country that taxes significantly its investments. 24.3% of investments is tax costs. So the first instrument we used was reducing the tax costs on green investments only. The second instrument was concessional finance in the form of grants, that is non-reimbursable funding that was concentrated in the first years of the transitional phase, really to be able to break through inertia and concentrated on high cost, high risk green technologies. And we also simulated a carbon tax, but in a way that is very different from most studies. We did not simulate a carbon tax in the sense of internalizing an externality, of putting a price on an externality. The role of the carbon tax in our scenarios was to create the fiscal space. So the revenues raised with the carbon tax were used to cover for the expenses with tax reductions and with concessional finance, in a way that the green fiscal reforms had a neutral impact on the public sector. That is, all that the public sector would spend with grants and all the resources that are foregone that the government would give up from tax reductions for green investments, the government would recover these expenses with a carbon tax. I'm going a bit faster now because I'm aware of time. And here you have a detailed explanation for each of the technologies, what they are. You can see that in the paper as well, but going straight to the results. For the business as usual, as you may remember, this business as usual scenario is a scenario that reproduces the current trends and does not assume that there are differences in trends or there are additional policies that might change these trends. So what happens is that in the business as usual, Brazil in the future up to 2030 is characterized by a carbon intensive development path. Its greenhouse gas emissions grow faster than the world average following the recent trends, led by an increased consumption of fossil fuels, mainly driven by the manufacturing sectors. And despite some relevant socioeconomic improvements, such as a 40% increase in real GDP per capita in 2020 compared to 2018 levels. The baseline scenario shows that Brazil reproduces the typical structural characteristics of developing economies, mainly trade imbalance that aggravate external restrictions to long-term economic growth. So in the reference scenario, Brazil hardly diversifies its exports, which maintain their primary character and an intensity in natural resources exports, and is also critically dependent on external markets to obtain high-tech goods and maintain their growing dependence on fossil fuels. This is also an important aspect about Brazil. Brazil has a high percentage of dependence on foreign fossil fuels, mainly coal. The quality of the coal required for the iron and steel sector, for instance, which is a major user of this fuel, is imported. So this type of pattern of development does not produce neither the economic leap that we would like to see for the country, and neither reduces, in fact, it aggravates its pollution and its deterioration of the environment. So let's see how these results compare with the green fiscal policies scenarios. As you remember, it's a lot of scenarios, so I'm not going into details about all of them, but just to give an overview, the reform will start in 2018, it will go up to 2030, and what I would like to highlight in this slide that shows the result for GDP is that all of these scenarios produce positive GDP impact compared to the business as usual scenario. And this is noteworthy because even when we look at the business as usual scenario, it's actually a very optimistic scenario. The economic growth is actually very optimistic indeed. And with the green fiscal policy reforms, you could have even more economic growth. And the scenario that delivers the highest rate, the best economic performance, is the most ambitious green fiscal policy reforms. That is the policy reform that provides stimulus for all low carbon technologies for manufacturing sectors, is also the one that delivers the best GDP results. This
me add on, and this is because their model doesn't assume equilibrium. So you can invest, and there's free resources in Brazil, and they're not constrained. So that when there's an employment, you can employ more people. You can, and this investment comes through as a positive impact. That doesn't happen in many computable general equilibrium models when you constrain, because prices will adjust and they'll be crowding out, and you cannot achieve positive results. But it's far from real life that you don't have everyone employed, as you know, probably yourself from your own experiences in your country and elsewhere. So sorry, Camila, to interrupt you. But,
that's a good point. Yeah, feel free to jump in anytime. Another point I wanted to highlight here is that, yes, the highest results are obtained with the more ambitious green fiscal policy reform scenarios. But looking at individual technologies, the individual technologies that provide the best economic results in terms of GDP is energy efficiency. That's also something I wanted to highlight. When we look at investments, of course, the investments are the components of GDP that accelerate the most, because these policies were designed to accelerate investments, but they direct these new investments, these accelerated investments, towards low carbon investments. So we can say that it would produce a cycle of green investment-led GDP growth. And there is a peak in the beginning of the years, and then there is a sort of stabilization in terms of the additional investments in relation to the business as usual scenario, because in the latest years, it's simply a matter of maintaining the capital that is already there. So if we think that in the future new technologies will come in that might imply more investments, this investment cycle could be even more aggressive. Also, interestingly, we have the other component that accelerates GDP. And if we go back to that curve, we can see that there is a peak around 2021, 2022, and then it kind of stabilizes. The beginning of the peak follows the investments. So the investments drive the acceleration of the GDP in the early years, but then the investments stabilize, and what keeps the growth, what keeps the curve going up, is the increasingly positive results on trade. And this is because for two main reasons. The trade balance improves for two main reasons. The first is that there is a significant decrease in imports of fossil fuels. As I mentioned in the beginning, Brazil imports a significant share of its fossil fuels the country consumes. And also, what was more interesting is that in many sectors, the low carbon investments improve the competitiveness of some sectors. So they saw an increase of their exports as well. So in net terms, there was an increase in the trade balance. And here we can see the impact in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. We use the year 2018 as the basis. You can see the business as usual scenario at the top. So that would be the growth in CO2 emissions. These are the total CO2 emissions of the country. They would grow close to 30% from 2018 to 2030 in the business as usual scenario. But what we can see is that the green fiscal policy scenarios, they managed to reduce that growth. And even though there aren't any absolute reductions, because all of them induce a growth of emissions compared to the year 2018, still these are significant results because we are only applying policies on the manufacturing sectors. These policies are not addressed at major greenhouse gas emitters in Brazil, mainly deforestation and agriculture. So it's really, it was surprising because we saw that the low carbon investments in the manufacturing sectors, and of course the carbon tax, they led to some decarbonization in other sectors as well. And the main results we have for 2013, and we will be close to wrapping up. I'm not going to many details, but just to say that the energy efficiency is the individual technology that had the best economic performance. The sustainable biomass, this is an interesting scenario because, as you may recall, in this scenario, we simply substitute unsustainable biomass from deforestation by investing in the forestry sector to provide sustainable biomass for the manufacturing sector to use. This is the scenario that provides very small economic benefits. The change in GDP is really very close to zero, as you can see on the chart. The investment growth isn't very significant, and it actually has a slight negative impact on trade. And I'm highlighting this because the point that the analysis of the individual technology allows us to make is that a mitigation strategy, a strategy to address climate change, should really include the manufacturing sectors if we also want to make climate policy part of a development strategy, because investments in the manufacturing sectors, they can really provide more significant economic results. And of course, the most ambitious or the most comprehensive green fiscal policy scenario is the one that provides the best economic impacts as well as the highest reduction in CO2 emissions. And all of these can be achieved with a very small carbon tax. You can see that the more technologies are added, more in the green fiscal policies portfolios, more incentives need to be provided, and hence a higher carbon tax rate needs to be applied to pay for these incentives. And even so, the carbon tax is really very small. It will only be an amount of 7.4 euros per ton of CO2. It's a very small carbon tax that will be required to pay or to create the fiscal room for all of these green fiscal stimulus. So some final remarks. The green fiscal reforms, they help reduce Brazil's external vulnerability, mainly by reducing dependency of imports of fossil fuels, which, as you know, can be highly price volatile and subject to supply disruptions, especially oil. It also helps increase Brazilian exports of medium and high technology manufacturers. That was also very interesting result that we got, because the economy becomes more capital intensive. It accumulates productive and technological skills that increase the competitiveness of more technologically complex products. Looking at individual technologies, again, energy efficiency technologies present the most gains in terms of GDP growth, improved trade balance, and reduced CO2 emissions. However, the impacts are more prominent in the scenarios that simulate the joint implementation of more mitigation technologies. Most of the gains come under the more comprehensive green tax reform. Under the scenario sustainable biomass, which is the closest scenario to what the country had been doing at the time for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, it reduces emissions significantly, of course. It's this sector, forestry sector, land use, they are major emitters of greenhouse gases in Brazil, but they do not deliver the results as economically impactful as other scenarios. And our main conclusion is that the right policy mix can put Brazil and possibly other developing economies on a development path that is more sustainable both economically and environmentally. In the case of Brazil, what we can observe is that a portfolio of tax incentives for green investments and carbon pricing can help reconcile the reduction of CO2 emissions and socio-economic progress. Annela, would you like to say some final remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Camila. Yeah, it's not much to add to that. This is the final slide, but it's just to show how important it is that the money is invested back, and that there is it's collected from tax, and that new opportunities are generated, and green fiscal policies can provide those opportunities and have sort of double benefits, and economy plus reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants.
Thank you very much, Camila. Thank you very much, Annela. I think I have one question here. When I was reading the paper, I think the most striking result for me is that there's no a silver bullet, so to speak, in order to tackle this challenge of climate change and everything. I think the most important thing that you show is that we need a set of policies, and we need very different ways to try to achieve this. But you focus on tax incentives. What do you think about the other spending policies that the state can make, and how you can not only design a fiscal framework based on tax, but a fiscal framework also based on expenditures to deal with the climate change and everything?
If I may start, and then perhaps Camila can pick up. Yeah, if you had the silver bullet, you could give it to me as well. So it would be great to have. So this is what the work over the years we have been doing, and there were the years. Now things are moving a little bit, but then there were the years when we're trying to say that carbon price on its own won't solve the problem. and you need a portfolio of policies. And you need the portfolio of investment, private investment, and also like government investment. And you need fiscal policies, particularly true via government investment in order to tackle climate change. And you need international cooperation. And there's often like when modeling exercises are done, they're using only carbon price. And we tried it once. I think it's about 10 years ago. We were looking with Terry, like, what does it need to be if you used only carbon price? We see numbers like $2,000 to $3,000 per ton of CO2. So I would do advise you go to your government and say that, okay, it can solve the problem, but we need a carbon tax like this. So it will never happen, because they will be out of office immediately, like if they made a proposal like that. So hence you really need, as you said, you need a portfolio of policies. You need to think of like what sort of government investment could be, where they need to invest, what sort of redirection of investments is, and these are like also regulation. I know economists don't like regulation, but in a certain extent it does work. So if you don't allow, like if you start like we have now in banking, that banks have policies already in Europe here that you cannot invest into brown. You can't invest into brown industries, so no brown investments anymore, and phasing out them like gradually by 2035. So there's no investment into fossil fuel industry, and also that comes with liability rules, and there are more and more court cases that this is you're making this investment as a bank, and therefore you're damaging the environment and people deliberately. So all these things that often we don't see in modeling, but you're completely right. So we did sort of this study focuses on sort of taxes, but we have done many studies like looking at all other measures, but portfolios of measures really. And international cooperation is absolutely key here, so that when one country develops the technology, that the other country could benefit from that. But we, in the world, it doesn't work so easily. In the model, you can do it. So saying that the investment if you don't stop the spillover effects and through trade relationships, you do get the impacts on other regions, positive impacts as well. But I'll stop here and then I will to Camila, maybe she wants to add something.
Thank you, Annela. And I completely agree, Norberto, with your points and with what Annela just said, and I think they are very complementary. I think that in a way we can say that this paper contributed to a new line of research that looks at different instruments other than carbon pricing. The logic that has dominated economics of climate change is the logic of internalizing externalities via carbon pricing, be it a carbon tax or a carbon market. And what we want to show is that carbon taxing alone or carbon pricing alone is very damaging to the economy, because you are increasing costs and you are giving nothing back to the economy. But if you use carbon taxing as a different role, it does not have the role of internalizing an externality in our simulation. It has the role of creating the fiscal space, creating room for the public sector to do other types of interventions. And we have focused on tax reductions, yes, but most of the expenditure of the government are on grants. So it's basically the government providing funds for the manufacturing sectors to invest in low carbon technologies. And I think there is a lot more room to look at other instruments, as you say, Norberto, public procurement, regulations. There is a diverse range of different instruments, different policy instruments that should be considered. And I think that the point we wanted to make with this portfolio of instruments is exactly that. We have to look at the mix, the type of instruments used matter. If you're only interested in reducing emissions, perhaps you can use only one, it will be simpler. But if you're also interested, and that's especially relevant for developing countries such as Brazil, if you're also interested in using this strategy of now there's lots of debate on the Green New Deal, green recovery, sustainable recovery. If you want to make these investments as part of a development strategy, of a long-term strategy, you need to look at a portfolio of instruments.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Annela. We have one question from the audience. Roberta Bruno is saying, hi, I have a question. Is there a way to make carbon taxes permanent? Because in some countries like Australia, they had carbon taxes for a period during the high commodities prices, but when the commodities prices hit that country, they stopped the carbon taxes as an incentive to improve competition in the mining sector. So how to make it to make a permanent use and protect the environment as well?
Okay, maybe I can start now, but I'm sure Annela will give many examples of countries in the EU. Australia is a case that is much studied because the country started designing very interesting policies, but then lobby came in, political economy came in, and changes in government as well. So it's a country that is much studied in this sense. It was going through a direction and then it kind of retreated. But yes, it can be permanent. There the first carbon tax, I think they must be now like 30 or 40 years. I think the first one was in Denmark, right? In the beginning of the 1990s. So Annela can perhaps tell with more property than I, the examples of the European countries, these countries that already have carbon taxes and maintain their carbon taxes even when the carbon markets came in, the European emissions trading systems.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's to make a carbon tax permanent. It does require political will to do that, and it's not an easy task, of course. But then, yeah, Camila's example of Scandinavia is a good example. You could take like Finland, that it's 1990 when they imposed a carbon tax. And at that time, there were talks in the European Union to have an European-wide carbon tax, but it's really difficult to have it EU-wide because EU is not it's not United States of Europe, so it's not a country. It's more like a group, so that has some common rules, but not common fiscal policy. And hence, if you want to have a carbon tax, then everyone needs to agree. All member states or EU Parliament members have to agree to that. So you need a unanimous vote agreement, and this didn't happen. And they implemented a carbon tax in the early 90s, and the tax level was, I must say, quite impressive. It was €1 per ton of CO2. So, and there was no objections by industry at all. But then gradually it has been increased. And this way they started, like it was just to get people used to get the admin system in place. And the industry has actually said that there are benefits of implementing of carbon tax. So they started to see like where they can reduce the emissions with no cost, and then they got into investments how to reduce emissions, and then they found that they actually do have some competitive advantage, and the impacts that were predicted by modeling groups weren't actually that bad. So. But in certain extent, it supports the border hypothesis. But in stringent environmental policies may be good for competitiveness. But it's not an easy task. So it really requires political will and the industry support and public support and so on. But once you see the benefits, it can work. Yeah, thanks. Very good question.
Yeah, And just to complement, so there is a report by the World Bank that updates the status of the countries in carbon pricing mechanisms, and they talk about two waves of adoption of carbon price instruments, mainly carbon taxes. So the first one was in the 1990s with Scandinavian countries at the leadership in the EU, and then there was another wave in the late 2000s with developing countries adopting carbon taxes in South Africa, in Latin American countries, in Argentina, in Colombia. And this has to do with the circumstance that is close to what we are living in right now, which is they needed to create fiscal space for other policies. And it makes sense. This is a modern instrument. This is a fiscal instrument that has acceptance in the sense that you are taxing a bad thing. When you tax value added, for instance, it can create resistance because value added is good. You do not want to increase the cost of something good, or even payroll taxes. That the logic of taxing something that's bad and reducing the tax burden on things that are good has a lot of traction. And I agree completely with Annela. I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to political will, because the evidence is quite clear on the effectiveness of carbon taxes in both reducing emissions, and when its revenues are used either to reduce other taxes or to go to public spending in some strategic areas, they can also have positive socioeconomic impacts.
If I may jump in, and one thing that, at the other hand, you have this strategy, but at the other hand, you have also people from the modern monetary theory saying that, okay, there's no problem to fund, you don't need to create a previous fiscal space. You can just spend, and so all the Green New Deal, thinking is more or less tied to this. Sorry, I forgot the word now. But to the framework that the state is able to a fiscal framework that says that the state is able to fund everything it wants. And so when you design a strategy, we know that it's difficult politically to impose a carbon tax, but on the other hand, it's also difficult politically to have this expansion of debt, and also especially in Brazil right now. So how do you see how do you think this set of policies in this framework that is alternative, that you don't need these taxes, you can just spend, and how this could fit to the exercise that you are trying to do in this paper, or not? Sorry. You're muted.
Camila, you're muted.
Sorry.
Classicism.
Classic. It was about time. So yeah, that's a very, very important question. And let me first provide a disclaimer I should have done from the beginning. Many of the views expressed on the paper and that I am expressing right now do not necessarily coincide with those of CEPAL. So I'll develop a bit more on this point, because I consider this to be a very, very important one. And so I think that we need to frame your question in the present context. The present context is a very serious one, not just for Brazil, but for worldwide economies. At CEPAL, we estimate that the drop in GDP in 2020 was 7.7%, which is the highest drop in GDP in 120 years since we began registering economic statistics in the region. So it's not an exaggeration to say that perhaps we are living the most complex economic and social crisis in history in the region. And for Brazil, it's not different. And in this sense, what we advocate at CEPAL is for a transformative recovery. We cannot go back to where we were prior to the pandemic, with high unemployment, with high informality, with high gender, racial, ethnic gaps, with increasing environmental deterioration, with very low economic dynamism. If we look at the last 5-year rates, it's very close to zero on average. So it doesn't make sense in any of the dimensions, either economic, social, or environmental. So we do understand that we should take the opportunity, of course, no crisis is an opportunity, but there is a window here to think of recovery strategies that put us on a different path. And the path that CEPAL understands, the direction for this future, is that of sustainability and equality. Having said that, my understanding, Camila, is that this is such an exceptional moment that we have to make use of exceptional tools and frameworks and policies. We have to be innovative. If we keep using the same generation, the same types of policies, we will not achieve this transformation. And in this sense, I think that we will have to do both, Norberto. I think we will have to use innovative fiscal instruments, modern tax policies, modern green fiscal reforms, as well as increasing debt. I think it's inevitable. If we really want to achieve deep structural transformation within the next years, I think we will have to reach out and learn. I think it will be a learning process. We will need to adjust and improve, but I think it will be necessary to consider a wider spectrum of policies. And in fact, many countries of the region are already trying and experiencing, and I think that we should continue or even go deeper onto this path.
Thank you, Camila. Well, what you're saying is really close to another question we have here from Felipe Aguiar. He says, hello, Annela and Camila. Brazilian environmental and sustainability policy seems to have changed substantially since 2018. Did events since then made you aware of something that would need to change in the model or require additional attention?
If I may add, just okay, we are trying to design policies that promote a transition for a low carbon economy, and now current law government seems to just take the path in the opposite way. So it's very difficult to say that. We don't have the baseline scenario is just, okay, the Bolsonaro scenario is much worse than the baseline one.
Okay, maybe I can start, Annela, please feel free to jump in. I don't want to dominate the discussions. Yes, of course. As Annela said in the beginning, this is a model that requires updating constantly. It will permanently require updating, and it will require updating for the reason I was just saying. This is the most dramatic moment in economic history of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's very dramatic also for other regions. And these impacts of the pandemic will reflect on different econometric coefficients. So this exercise will need to be carried out, and it will be to permanently be carried out, because the behavior patterns are changing, structural changes are happening. There are many things in this type of modeling that we cannot capture beforehand. We could never have anticipated a pandemic with our modeling. So the nature of the model, because it's based on historic data, it's based on the past, it makes it necessary for continuous updating. So that's one part. The other part is, I think that the current context actually make our results even more relevant, because we point out types of policies that can help the economy recover, that can help accelerate economic activity, that can help increase investments. If we look at the investments level in Brazil, it's at historic low. So we provide insights. Of course, we probably would need to update and include some of the shocks in the model to have more accurate figures, which we have actually done in a different report that I'm happy to share with you with the help of Dr. Annela as well. So our main documents at CEPAL or CLAC is the sessions document, Documento Período de Sessões. It's a document we produce every couple of years, and we launched our most recent one in October last year, in which we use the 3ME to estimate the impacts of the pandemic in the region and to point out scenarios of sustainable recovery, or what we call a big push for sustainability. We presented simulations very similar to what we have presented here for the case of Brazil, but in the case of this report, we included all Latin American and Caribbean countries and all other sectors as well. And we came to conclusions very similar to what we have presented to you here today. There is a clear path for recovery of the economy, of GDP, of jobs, based on sustainable investments in strategic areas, in renewable energy, in the electrification of transport, in manufacturing sectors. Anyway, there's a whole range of strategic areas that we have identified that can be a traction or can be a big push for a new cycle of economic development with sustainability and equality. But perhaps Annela would like to provide some insights as well.
Yeah, thanks, Camila. Yeah, so just to add, of course, Camila knows more about the Brazilian situation and what's happening there than I do, and I possibly could do. But in terms of the modeling, yes, for example, the pandemic, there are no models. It doesn't have, not just this model, but none of the models can actually foresee these things like that. So of course you need to do adjustments after this kind of shocks exogenously and adjust. The other thing is what has been changed, and that applies again to most of the models, is if you probably all have heard about the productivity puzzle. So it's the economy itself has changed. So the way we do things, even we here now, like if it was a normal situation, normal before the pandemic, it's normal now as well, but it's a new normal. So I would have been like flying over, spending money to come to, and we don't do it now, isn't it? So it's and if you look at the IT economy and the production of goods that manufacturing, and that could be replicated like very, very quickly, things with almost no cost. This has all changed, and these models not many models capture these things. So these are the updates that need to be doing. So we're shifting to new economic models that we just goes from this what we have seen for a couple of hundred years. It starts shifting away to a completely new reality. The other thing, when we talk about E3ME, is particularly is land use. And forestry as a sector, timber industry is in the model, but it's not just that, isn't it? So the land use could be represented a little bit better there, but it's difficult. And not many of those models have actually climate impacts, and that kind of got closely linked to land use. So you do run your scenarios, so like we did the reducing CO2 emissions, but there is no sort of impact of climate. They were quite short term, but there's no impacts of climate change back to the model. And not many, some of them have, but in a very, very simplified way, and very difficult to do because you don't know, like it's just more or less similar to the pandemic situation. So you don't know whether where the next heat wave will hit and things like that. They're slowly captured in historical data, but because climate change is accelerating, so it's very difficult to predict forward these things or just to incorporate the future. It's not even predictions, but into future scenarios, because we don't predict future, we just do scenario modeling. But it's, that these are improvements that could be made, really, but not the easy ones. They're not easy ones. So, because we never lived climate change, we don't know. If we had this experience, then we would know the impacts and how does it work out. But now we don't know. We don't know. Like suddenly there can be a tipping point and everything changes, and entire areas could be like out of water, for example, or something. And so these are the things that could be further just thought of. But on the other hand, it's already a very complex model, and the more complex you make it, the more the more errors, the more uncertainty is in your results. And it's sort of two sides. The coin has got two sides. So on the other hand, you can answer more questions. On the other hand, you'll have more uncertainty. So thanks.
Thank you, Annela. Thank you, Camila. I think we are going to finish now. Have 1 hour and 10 minutes. It's okay. So if no one have another question, I'd like to thank you very much for Annela and Camila for joining us today. It was a big pleasure. And also, we were trying. Actually, the name of you both was suggested by Márcio a year ago, and only now we are having it a long time ago. Yeah. So thank you very much. It was really nice to have this conversation. I will apologize to Annela, and I'll turn to Portuguese just for announce the next seminars and so on. So sorry, Annela, but vamos lá, gente. Bom, a gente... Engraçado que eu estava olhando aqui na hora de anunciar os próximos seminários, né? E anunciar os próximos eventos aqui no canal do Instituto de Economia. E interessante que nesse último mês a gente teve um mês mais ou menos inteiro aqui de programações, bem ou mal, lidando com os tópicos de mudança climática, de o que pensar o futuro e tudo mais. Então, a gente teve a discussão do professor Cadu e do Márcio, né, do dia 30 de abril, sobre os princípios para a construção de uma macroeconomia pós-keynesiana do meio ambiente. Depois, lá no outro programa, lá do Sistema Financeiro e Debate, a gente recebeu a Denise Pavarina, né, que é vice-presidente da Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Então, foi uma conversa super interessante também, mas com uma outra visão, uma visão, né, de uma pessoa de mercado e tudo, que a gente, às vezes, na academia fica aqui discutindo, e ela está sentada lá ainda, né, fazendo as coisas. Então, é super interessante também ouvir um pouco esse outro lado, ainda que, né, você não precisa concordar necessariamente com tudo. Hoje a gente teve aqui esse seminário que foi excelente também. O paper é muito legal, convido todo mundo a dar uma lida. Confesso que ainda estou tentando entender direito o negócio do modelo ali, né? Mas, enfim, em algum momento eu quero nem ver essas equações abertas, que deve ser uma... E hoje à noite, eu acho que para fechar também esse mês, vamos dizer assim, o professor Eduardo Costa Pinto vai receber o Cadu de novo para discutir justamente a destruição das políticas ambientais no Brasil, hoje à noite aqui às 7, no canal do Instituto. O nosso próximo webinar, a gente vai receber o professor Carlos Gadelha, da Fiocruz, que a gente vai fazer uma espécie de mesa redonda. Teve recentemente o lançamento, né, do Caderno de Desenvolvimento Especial sobre o Complexo Econômico Industrial da Saúde 4.0, no contexto da Covid-19, e a gente vai receber, além do Gadelha, o Felipe Camilla, que é da UF, da Fiocruz, e também a Natália Guimarães, que é a nossa doutoranda aqui, que fez parte disso tudo. Acho que vai ser uma super discussão também, mas aí a gente volta ao horário normal, sexta-feira, às 3 horas, no dia 11 de junho. Beleza, gente? Acho que é isso. Obrigado a todo mundo. So, I'll turn to English again. Thank you, Annela. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Camila. I don't know if you want to say a last word.
Thank you.
Yeah, Annela, you first, please.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really a pleasure. And if anyone has any questions, do get in touch too. And I'm happy to answer. Continue the conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you as well, Norberto, Lydia, and everybody who's watching us for your attention, for inviting us. And I also have to say that Professor Cadu Young was my supervisor for my master's dissertation. So he's also guilty for much of the things that I said here today. But yeah, as Annela said, we are available. Anyone who has questions, please feel free to get in touch. And congratulations again on the initiative of these webinars, which are really very interesting.
Thank you. E agradeço também, faltou o agradecimento de sempre em português ao Guilherme e à Camila, que são responsáveis aí pela nossa arte, estão com a gente aí já nessa mais de ano, né, Guilherme? Gente, obrigado então, um abraço a todos. Bye, Annela. Bye, Camila.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.